Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about whether campaigns are about persuasion or mobilization. One of the most important questions a political campaigner must ask themselves is how much their campaign is about persuading people to vote and how much of it is about mobilizing people to vote. How they answer this question will dictate a lot about their campaign plan, and many campaign strategies and tactics fall into one of these two buckets. Some voters, no matter what you do, will never be convinced to vote for you or your cause, while some voters are guaranteed to vote for you. And there are a ton of electoral factors that impact whether you should focus primarily on persuasion or on mobilization. Yet there are no clear guidelines or checklists that tell you which one you should use. So how do we distinguish between persuasion and mobilization? And which one is, quote unquote, best? Can one campaign use both? What electoral factors should we look at to determine which way we should go, whether it's persuasion or mobilization? And perhaps most importantly, why does this matter for you, even if you aren't involved in politics for a living? That's what today's episode is about, so let's get into it. First of all, what exactly is the difference between persuasion and mobilization? Some people, no matter what you do, no matter what you say, no matter how convincing you think you are, they are just never going to vote for you. They've already got their mind made up that they're going the opposite direction. There's nothing you can do about it. Likewise, there are some people that are going to vote for you no matter what you do. You could have all sorts of scandals or gaffes, any sort of things that you think would tank your standing with some other voters. There are still some voters that are just going to steadfast be behind you. Now, how many of those voters there are for each of those groups, that depends on the race. But it's ultimately about knowing who is in your base. So that is the people who are already predisposed to vote for your candidate or your cause, and who is not in that base. It's not necessarily an exact science, though. There's no, like I said at the intro, there's no clear checklist or rubric that tells you, okay, this is a persuadable voter. This is a mobilization voter. You have to determine that through analyzing the race and all its factors. So let's get a little bit more into both of these kinds of strategies, if you will. So mobilization, it's about galvanizing your existing base so that they are energized to come out to vote for you. These are the quote unquote true believers. These common appeals that you see when it comes to mobilization, if you look at campaigns that mobilize voters, they usually will highlight a candidate's partisan or ideological credentials. This one's a true conservative warrior. This one is a true liberal warrior or progressive warrior. And they'll also advertise in media that base typically consumes. So if you are conservative and you're trying to appeal to conservative voters, you'll probably advertise in things like Fox News or Newsmax or One American News. If you're a liberal, you might be advertising things like NBC News, CNN, or Slate. When it comes to mobilizing, you could be mobilizing for your side or against the other side. A lot of campaign appeals are about, we can't let this other person win. They're terrible. Are you going to be a good Democrat? Are you going to be a good Republican and vote for us so we don't have this terrible person that's going to destroy everything? A lot of mobilization appeals sound like that. This is often the quote-unquote easier of the two between mobilization and persuasion, because these are people who are already predisposed to vote for you. So you have to do relatively less work to convince them, but it's not easy by any means. At least for some of these voters, it's not easy to mobilize them. If you don't mobilize these kinds of voters, they probably just won't vote at all. These are people that are very likely just like, I can't vote for the other person, but you suck and I can't vote for you. So they'll just stay at home, or they'll come out to vote, but they'll just not vote on your particular race. They'll just fill out the rest of the ballot. Now, on the other side is persuasion. This is about convincing people not already in your existing base to, quote unquote, come over to your side to vote for your candidate or your cause. And common appeals will be things like hiding the personal traits of the candidate. This person's honest. He's got integrity. He served in the military. Now, whether they're honest or they have integrity, obviously that's in the eyes of the beholder. But you often hear about those kinds of things. It doesn't necessarily focus on specific issue stances. Now, sometimes it will, but a lot of times it will just try to be more straight emotional appeals of like, oh, look at how great this person is as a human being. Or it'll be try to be informative, like, oh, you don't know about this person, so let me tell you about him. Now, obviously, whether the information they're giving you is true or not, I mean, that's for you to figure out. And advertising and media that people outside the base consume. So if a Republican candidate thinks that there are some people that they can get on the other side, they might advertise in liberal resources. And if there's a Democrat that thinks they can get some Republican voters, they'll advertise in more conservative media. Now, obviously, that could be a bit of a gamble, but there's all sorts of media outlets. There's a plethora of media outlets that people can advertise in. And then, of course, you have the ones that are not specifically for one or the other side, like some newspapers. Some newspapers will clearly side with Republicans or Democrats, but not all of them will. Or some of them might be slightly leaning towards one side or the other, but they still have a good mix of both left, right, and middle voters. And so this can be about persuading people about why your side is the better or only good option, or about why the other side is not fit for office. So it can sound a little bit like mobilization sometimes. It's not just about convincing people, though, through arguments about your views on political issues. Some people just have their political views set in stone. Even if they're persuadable voters, they still might have concrete issue stances that are just not do not coincide with your own if you're running for office. But you might try to get these people on personal traits or their capability of winning, or why somebody who doesn't often vote should come out to vote for you. So some people are just either irregular voters or they don't vote at all. So those people you might have to persuade to come out. And that is very difficult because voting is a habit. If people don't typically vote, it's very hard to get them to come out to vote now. Now, candidates like Barack Obama and Donald Trump, they were more effective than usual at getting voters who don't typically, or registered voters that don't typically vote. They were more effective at getting those people to come out, but those are exceptions to the rule. That doesn't really happen very often, especially for non-presidential candidates. But if you don't persuade these kinds of voters, they might vote for the opposition because they can be persuaded one way or the other. And they still might stay home because they're just not persuaded by anybody. But these are the people that you run more of a risk of losing to the other side. Now, these are not mutually exclusive in every case. I'm not trying to say that they are. I think it's just easier to separate the two for the sake of informing and teaching people about these kinds of tactics and strategies. Some tactics that are meant to activate your base could also be trying to persuade people outside the base to support, though. Like you're talking about how horrible the other person is and that they're going to destroy everything. You're trying to energize your base to make sure that you keep America safe and that America doesn't die. And meanwhile, that kind of fear is also possibly persuading other people who don't typically vote for you to say, oh man, that other candidate, he really is going to destroy us all. We need to vote for this other person who's going to make sure that America is the best it's ever been. And an individual voter who could be mobilized for one candidate or issue might be persuadable on a different candidate or issue. Maybe they're just they're going to vote Democrat, or they're going to vote Republican, or they're going to vote third option for president every time. But maybe there's a mayoral candidate on the other side of the aisle that they're intrigued by or that they know personally and they think, I actually really like this person. I'm going to vote for them. And also, most campaigns must use at least a little bit of both persuasion and mobilization. I know I made it sound, it might have sounded a little bit like, oh, these are two separate things. You got to do one or the other. No, that's not true. Rarely, if ever, is a campaign going to go 100% into one side or the other. I was just separating the two just to make clear the difference between the two. But many campaigns will have to go heavily one way or the other. And if you're typically, if you have an advantage in the electorate and you have a much larger base than the opposition, you're probably going to focus more on mobilization. If you're at a disadvantage, you're probably going to have to do more persuading. So again, while there are no clear rules on what you should do, where if A, then you do mobilization. If B, then you do persuasion. Doesn't work like that. But there are some general rules of thumb that you might want to follow for mobilization versus persuasion. But every election has unique circumstances, so don't just assume that you're going to do one or the other without analyzing the race and the district and the candidates and all the other factors involved. And there are going to be a bunch of these factors that are relevant, and they're all going to combine at the same time. Some that might sound more like you want to do mobilization, but then some that sound more like you want to do persuasion. Some of those factors are going to be more conducive to one or the other. And if you ask one person on a given factor whether you should focus more on mobilization, another person might think that you should do more persuasion. And then there's also the difference between academics and political practitioners, the people who are actually on the ground. They tend to see things differently too. Academics can look at it from a 10,000-foot view, look at everything generally, and also have the time to study these things. Whereas political practitioners are very focused on their specific races, and they have to make decisions quick. So you also have to keep those perspectives in mind. So for many of these factors, one might argue that persuasion is more effective, while somebody else can say it is mobilization. It is not often going to be a clear objective like this is what you should do. But we're going to give you some examples of factors where you might want to mobilize or you might want to persuade. So let's talk about some of those. First of all, if we're comparing Republicans and Democrats to independents, relatively speaking, independents are generally going to have to do more persuading than Republicans or Democrats do. Why? Well, shameless plug for my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive. That dives into many reasons why independents will have to persuade versus mobilize, but I'll talk about a few here. For one, independents have much lower turnout rates than the main parties. So there is less of a base to go with because even though it looks like, wow, there's a lot of independent voters, and there are a lot of independent voters, and a lot of times in polling, they show up as a plurality, meaning they are a larger group than either Democrats or Republicans, not both of them together. They're not a majority, they're a plurality. But independents still turn out at much lower rates. So the base is not as big as you think it is. And also, independents have a whole wide variety of reasons why they are independent. And not necessarily because they are middle of the road and they think the two parties are more extreme. Some of them actually think the parties are not far enough to one side or the other. They think Republicans are not far enough to the right or that Democrats are not far enough to the left. It might be a completely different reason. Maybe people just don't really know which party they want to go for. Whatever the reason, independents are not a cohesive group. So they are not, just because you're an independent candidate does not make all independents part of your base. And many independent voters still simply go with the party that they typically lean towards because they think that it's a quote unquote wasted vote if you choose an independent candidate. So they might as well vote for what they see as the lesser of two evils. And then independents typically have less media coverage and lower name recognition, so they just don't get themselves out there as much. Partly of their own accord, and partly because media just won't cover them. Or when they do cover them, it tends to be for a particular gaffe that an independent candidate made. But then between Republicans and Democrats, Republicans sometimes will do a little bit more mobilizing than Democrats do, because Republicans usually turn out at a little bit of a higher rate than Democrats do. Not always, but generally speaking. And then Republicans are slightly more ideologically uniform. They're a little bit more cohesive on what conservatism is. So mobilization appeals, like a Republican's ideological credentials, tend to be a bit more effective for them than Democrats. Democrats don't all subscribe to the progressive label, or a lot of them don't necessarily subscribe to the progressive label. Some of them just say that they're liberal. There's not as much cohesiveness ideologically for Democrats. So there will be a little bit more mobilization on the Republican side. But remember, that is not always the case. If one major party heavily outnumbers the other major party, that more numerous party is probably going to mobilize more, and the less numerous party is probably going to have to persuade more, because if you have a larger base, especially a significantly larger base, then you're really just worried about, okay, I got to make sure all the people that are predisposed to vote for me all come out to vote. But if you're at that disadvantage, then you realize, okay, I need to convince more people to come and vote. Otherwise, I'm going to get waxed in the election results. So, larger base, typically more mobilization. Smaller base, typically more persuasion. And then if either the Republican or Democratic Party decides not to run a candidate, which there are a lot of elections that are uncontested, which is very unfortunate. We should strive to have every election contested and have at least two candidates, if not more. So if a Democrat or a Republican candidate don't run, if it's just a Republican or just a Democrat, an independent may function as a stand-in for that missing party, in which case the independent might start mobilizing that missing party's candidates, though they may still need to persuade many of them to cross over, because some of those voters will still vote only Democrat no matter what, and some of those voters will only vote Republican no matter what. So some of them might be a little bit more skeptical, but still open to persuasion, and in which case that independent who is filling in for that Democrat or Republican needs to persuade. Another factor to look at is whether you are trying to win a primary or a general. Obviously, in the end, you're trying to win a general election, but your mobilization versus persuasion strategy might change from the primary to the general. But there's this very simplistic view that regular citizens often believe, that primary is about who can be the most extreme or ideological, while general elections are about moving towards the middle. That's not always true. Sometimes it'll be true, but it's very overly simplified, because there are a variety of primary types in U.S. elections, not just that they all have their own unique electoral factors like number of Republicans and Democrats and independents, but the primary structure itself is different, and that will subsequently influence how much persuasion and mobilization you do. So in a closed primary, which means only people of that party can vote in that party's primary. So if I'm a Republican, I can only vote in a Republican primary. If I'm a Democrat, I can only vote in the Democratic primary. You're probably going to mobilize more, because you are trying to get the party's base behind your campaign and not with the other candidates for that same party. And then when you start getting more and more of these candidates in a primary and it gets very crowded, that can also affect things too, which we'll talk about a little bit more shortly. But if you're in an open primary or a top two primary, or Louisiana's unique majority vote system, where if in the primary you receive a majority of the vote, you automatically win the election. But if you only get a plurality, the top two vote getters go on to the general election. It's different than a regular top two primary, where no matter how much of the vote you get, top two vote getters go. So you can win 75, 80, 85% of the vote in a top two primary, you're still going to a general election. But in those cases, you might now have to do more persuasion because there is a wider variety of voters that are participating. But in any case, typically speaking, primaries see a lot more of these hardcore partisan and ideological voters. So there are usually more mobilization appeals then. Typically, people who are not as invested in one party or another, or in one ideology or another, are not going to be as enthused to come out for primaries. They don't want to have to come out multiple times to go vote. Or they're just like, you know what? I'm just going to wait for these people to decide who is going to be in the general election, and then I'll start participating. There's all sorts of reasons that people have for doing that. But the people who are like the really strong believers in parties or strong believers in just voting in general, those are the ones who are going to be typically voting in a primary. Sometimes you'll see an uptick from one year to the next, but primaries always see much lower turnout rates than general elections do, regardless of the primary type. And then so the number of primary candidates can also affect the mobilization versus persuasion calculus. A crowded primary might not let you mobilize as effectively because the base is split across multiple candidates. So you may need to persuade more people instead. So if you have like 6 candidates in a primary, whether it's a closed primary, open primary, whatever, now you might need to start changing up. You can't just rely on mobilization because even in a closed primary, you have a bunch of candidates in your party trying to vie for those same votes. And if you're in a top 2 or open or Louisiana's type of primary, now you have a whole bunch of other voters, and so you might have to try to pull some of those. So you also will sometimes see the Democratic or Republican Party try to convince a candidate or two to drop out if there are too many in the primary because they're afraid that the vote is going to split too much between their party's candidates, that it's going to let the other party actually take up those spots. So if it's like a top 2 primary, like in California, for example, and there's 6 Democrats in one race, and then there's 2 Republicans in that same race, you might see the Democratic Party try to tell 1 or 2 or 3 of those Democrats, hey, why don't you drop out? Obviously, the ones that they think have less of a chance of winning, because if those 6 Democrats split their votes up enough, then the Republican candidates could actually earn those top 2 spots. And then so they would be guaranteed a win in the general election, whichever of those Republicans win. Because in the top 2 primary, whoever the top 2 vote getters are, regardless of their party, go on to the general election. So sometimes it'll be 2 Democrats, sometimes it'll be 2 Republicans. I don't know if there's probably been at some point 2 independents running against each other in a general election, but you're almost never going to see that. And then, so the general election can look different from the primary in terms of focus on mobilization versus persuasion, because now there's an even wider variety of voters that are coming out to vote. Even if you're talking about a top 2 primary or Louisiana's type of primary, yes, even though anybody of any party can vote in those primaries, now you have the people who only vote in general elections also participating. So you might need to start persuading those people instead of just focusing on mobilization, because you just simply have more voters that are up for grabs, or that you at least need to make sure that you pull against the other candidate. And in the case of ranked choice voting, you'll probably need more persuasion there as well, at least if you have 3 or more candidates, because sometimes in a ranked choice voting election, you'll still only have 2 candidates running. But if you have 3 or more, you may need more persuasion, because if you don't win in the first round of voting, because in ranked choice voting, they tabulate votes in the first round. If nobody wins a majority, the lowest vote getter gets knocked out, and then they start voting this or tabulating the second place votes. And then so if you don't win in the first round of voting, you need to have convinced enough people to choose you in the second round. And then if there's a third round or fourth round, You'll need to have made sure that you convinced enough people to do that. It's not going to be as effective to mobilize people unless, again, your base is just that large, in which case even a ranked choice voting election might not be enough to make you have to try to persuade people, because you can just mobilize enough voters who are already predisposed to vote for you. Again, there's a lot of these factors that are working in tandem, so it affects the calculus. And another one of those factors is a partisan versus a nonpartisan election. So many elections, and certainly the vast majority of the most visible ones, are partisan, meaning candidates declare a party affiliation if they have one, and they are on the ballot as that party's candidate. I mean, you can potentially run as no party, but most candidates will have a Republican or Democrat or a third party label. But there are a lot of elections, mostly at the local level, that are nonpartisan, where candidates appear on the ballot without party labels. They may be registered to vote as a Republican or Democrat. In fact, in reality, most of them are going to be. And most of them are going to have certain cues that indicate they're Republican or Democrat. But on the ballot, they are officially nonpartisan. So in partisan elections, you might have more mobilization efforts than a nonpartisan election, because they can rely on the party label as a heuristic, basically a rule of thumb for people to think, okay, I know what this candidate's about, I'm going to vote for them. It's how people keep track of why they're voting for who they are voting for. And a lot of people just won't participate in a nonpartisan election because they just don't have that party cue. Because party label is the most predictive indicator of how someone will vote, making it the most potent mobilization factor. But some nonpartisan candidates, while they can't explicitly advocate as a Republican or Democrat in their campaign advertising or highlight party endorsements, the parties can still say who they endorse. So these voters who very much only vote Republican or Democrat can look at what their local party is saying and say, oh, okay, that's who they're pushing for. Oh, that's who I'm voting for. So you still may have a lot of mobilization efforts, not necessarily from the campaign itself, but from the parties. So if candidate Joe Schmo is running for office, yeah, he doesn't say that he's a Republican or a Democrat, but whichever party he is, that party might still try to mobilize people for his campaign. So even if your candidate's campaign is not doing mobilization or persuasion, the party might be doing it for you instead. Next up is ballot measures versus candidates. You've heard me say several times a candidate or an issue. That's because I'm in the case of issues, I'm referring to ballot measures. Now, ballot measure campaigns are similar to candidate campaigns in some respects, and then, of course, different in others. Ballot measures could be about an issue that typically has a partisan or ideological charge to it, so abortion, gun policy, labor unions, and if that's the case, you'll probably see more mobilization appeals, since there's going to be more of an existing voter base to tap into. You can say, this is a Democrat issue, this is a Republican issue, so we need all of the Democrats and all the Republicans we can get to vote for or against this issue. And then other ballot measures may have fewer partisan or ideological cues. So maybe something like term limits on government officials. That's not necessarily a Republican or Democrat or conservative or liberal issue. Education, government accountability. In this case, you might need more persuasion appeals because the base may not be as large or as obvious. You don't have a specific, like, oh, okay, we got to go get a bunch of Republicans to vote for this, or we got to get a bunch of Democrats to vote for this. You might need to pull from a lot of different sides. So you might see a lot of cases where politics make strange bedfellows, where Republican and Democratic groups will join in force for a ballot measure. And then on the other side, you'll see Republicans and Democrats against that measure for a whole bunch of different reasons. And then there's also the fact that how well known the issue or campaign is can complicate things too. So it's similar to the idea of name recognition for a candidate. Some measures get far more attention than others do, and the ones that have less attention may need more persuasion appeals because of the need to inform people about that issue or campaign. Whereas if you have a lot more attention on your campaign, you might have people who already have a specific opinion about that issue or about that ballot measure, and in which case then they are a base that you can tap into. And then another complication for whether to mobilize or persuade in ballot measure campaigns is whether you are on the yes side of a ballot measure or on the no side. So back in grad school, I can't remember his name, but I remember this part always stuck out to me. He said more or less that it is, generally speaking, all else equal, easier to win a no campaign than a yes campaign. The reason being, when you're trying to win with a yes campaign, you have to convince people beyond a shadow of a doubt, or at least strongly enough, that this ballot measure is needed to be implemented. Whereas on the no side, you just have to show just enough doubt. You don't have to have people fully against a ballot measure, but you need them to be against it a decent amount, just enough so that they say no. So it's usually going to be easier to win a no campaign versus a yes campaign, all else equal. So in that case, the yes side of a campaign for a ballot measure might need more persuasion tactics, because you need to make sure you convince people about how great this ballot measure is and how much it is necessary. Whereas if it's on the no side, the persuasion might not be as necessary because you don't have to work as hard to convince people not to vote for a ballot measure. Again, generally speaking. So you might actually do more mobilization appeals on the no vote. But again, you can ask multiple political practitioners whether to mobilize or persuade on a given ballot measure campaign, and even on the same side of a ballot measure campaign, and they might give you multiple answers. Lastly, before we end with why persuasion versus mobilization matters to you, even if you are not a political professional, let's run through some more electoral quirks that can impact persuasion or mobilization just real quick. So, name recognition, name ID, identification. Well-known candidates may be more reliant on mobilization since people know who these candidates are. Maybe some people who know who a candidate is but don't have an opinion yet, but a lot of times people already at least lean one way or another. Then there's money and other resources. So that inevitably impacts how much both mobilizing and persuasion you can do, because campaigns cost money. Everything you do costs money. So if you have a lot of money, you probably have more of a base to rely on because they gave you more funds with which to operate with. So you might focus on mobilizing more. Whereas if you have less money, you might need to persuade people not only to vote for you, but to also give you money. And persuasion sometimes, but not always, can cost more than mobilization, because you may have to try harder to convince people to vote for you, especially if they are people who don't often vote. And in some cases, the other side's base may be too large where you can't pull enough people from the other side, and you may have to try to get people who don't typically vote or vote at all to try to vote for you, which is an extraordinarily difficult task because, like we said earlier, voting's a habit. If people don't typically vote, it's very hard to get them to go vote. If they vote often, usually have to work less hard to get them to vote. Open seat versus incumbency. So if you're an incumbent or you're working for an incumbent, you're probably going to do a little bit more mobilization because you have an incumbency advantage simply by being in office already, because you are more well-known, you often have more resources, you don't have to grapple with the quote-unquote fear of the unknown. So part of why some people just choose incumbents is because they are afraid of, well, if we change this person, how do I know for a fact that this other candidate is going to fix things? Usually you have to be really upset enough with the incumbent to actually kick them out. That's why you see such very high incumbency win rates, especially in Congress, and similarly across the board in elections in general. But if you're a challenger to the incumbent, you might be having to persuade more. Even if people aren't that enthused about the incumbent, you have to try to get more people on your side because you have to tell people who you are and get them to you have to convince them to say, okay, you know what? We need something new. We need fresh ideas in this office. Now, if it's an open seat, meaning the incumbent is leaving for whatever reason, they unfortunately passed an office or they retired or they ran for a different office, now it gets a little bit trickier because if the previous office holder was well liked, then you might try to tie yourself to that incumbent. Obviously, if you typically support that incumbent or you're the same party. So you may be focusing on mobilization more because you're trying to say, hey, let's keep up what that incumbent did because he or she did such a great job and I'm going to keep the same job going. So vote for me and keep this gravy train going. So you might mobilize more. If you are unlike the well-liked incumbent, then you might need to do more persuading. But if the incumbent was not liked and they tried to hightail it because they knew they were going to lose re-election, now you might have things flipped. Now, if you are unlike the incumbent, you might be mobilizing more people because you have more of a base that's more likely to vote for you. And if you are more like that incumbent that people did not like, you might have to persuade people to say, hey, but I'm different because blah, blah, blah. So incumbency versus open seat can be a lot different. And then even if there is an incumbent, it could be a lot different based on whether that incumbent was liked or not when it comes to mobilization versus persuasion. Turnout rates. This one can be very tricky to determine whether to persuade or mobilize. Because if it's a low turnout election, like a lot of local offices are, even a few votes can make a big difference because there's not many of them to go around. So do you mobilize what you have since each vote is at a premium and there probably won't be any other votes to snag? Or do you persuade even a few quote unquote crossover votes to make a difference? You could argue one way or the other. I mean, you can on a lot of these things, but this one in particular is a little bit murky, I guess you could say. Because a lot of these low turnout rates, these are people who are pretty hardcore about participating in politics, and they typically side one way or another. So there might not be many persuadable votes that are there to go around. Hot button salient political issues. So if a particular issue is more salient and garners stronger responses from voters, that can really complicate persuasion versus mobilization because this might actually influence enough people to change their voting habit. So if a candidate who otherwise could rely more on mobilization gets caught up in a corruption scandal, and then the corruption scandal becomes a big political issue, whether or not that candidate is guilty of corruption, it's just the very perception of being tied to a corruption scandal that's a problem. So they might have to do more persuading to convince people, hey, I'm actually not that person. Or even if they are that person, they're still going to try to convince people they're not that person. So you thought you were going to mobilize more, but now you got to persuade because you got to make sure people think that you are still fit for the office. Or even if it's a more highly charged issue like abortion or gun policy, you may have been more mobilizing before, but now people the tide in your district or your state is starting to turn against your particular view on abortion or gun policy or whatever. Now people are trying to take you to task. Now you might need to start persuading more people about why you are still the person for office. And then lastly, districts with a history of swing voting. So a district that regularly changes who represents it or how it votes for governor and presidents and so on is probably going to need more persuasion than mobilization because it's already shown that it can go back and forth. It might be a noticeable group of the same voters that are vacillating between Republicans and Democrats, or just different voters showing up in different years. It doesn't necessarily mean the same exact voters are just changing their mind. It might be, but not necessarily the case. So just by default, you're going to have to do more persuading because you don't want people to swing away from you, or you're trying to get people to swing towards you, and there's already been a penchant for that district to swing both towards the Republicans and towards Democrats, or even towards an independent. Now, the number of these districts is decreasing, and what party they vote for is becoming more predictable. But if you're trying to, for example, win a governor's race and there's a particular district that doesn't necessarily outright change whether it votes for a Democrat or Republican, but it does shift much more one way. Like if it voted 35% Republican before, but then it votes 45% Republican this next election cycle, that might be enough for you to win a governor's race. So even if it doesn't swing completely towards one party or another, just making the vote margin in that district smaller can mean all the difference in an office that includes that district, but is not only for that district, like a U.S. House race, U.S. Senate, or governor. So, to end things off, why should persuasion versus mobilization matter to you? The distinction, which isn't always a distinction, is incredibly useful for a wide variety of people, even if you are not involved in politics. Now, for people who are involved in politics for a living, or want to do it for a living, or simply want to be a volunteer, it's probably obvious why you want to know, but I'm going to talk about it anyways. Some voters, no matter what you do, cannot be convinced to support you. You might think you are super persuasive, that your charisma is through the roof, that I can talk anybody into anything. No. There are some voters that are just not going to bite. Some campaigners think they are more persuasive than they actually are. And you're going to be surprised at some of the responses you get. But then there are some voters that, no matter what you do, cannot be mobilized, even if they would otherwise support you, because some campaigners think they have a larger base than they actually do. So even if somebody's registered as a Democrat and you're a Democratic candidate, they might rarely, if ever, vote. And like we said before, voting habits are hard to break. So if they don't regularly vote, even if you theoretically see them as part of your base, they're probably not going to vote. And then it's the same thing with Republicans. If it's a Republican that doesn't typically vote and you're a Republican candidate, they might not actually be part of your base because they don't typically vote. Knowing who to persuade and who to mobilize isn't just because you need to win a campaign. Obviously, that's the ultimate goal, but it also saves you a lot of time. You're not wasting your time trying to talk to people, trying to persuade people that can't be persuaded, or trying to mobilize people that can't be mobilized. You save money because your appeals cost money, whether you're going door to door, whether you are trying to send them mailers or advertise to them in some other way. And it costs you or saves you a lot of energy because you are not wasting your time and getting frustrated trying to appeal to people that are just not responding to your appeals. But even if you are not involved in politics, you should still understand why this distinction matters. You may have something you care about that is not necessarily all that political, but you can apply these mobilization versus persuasion principles to that issue. Or even if it becomes a political issue, you might not see it as a political issue, and it's just one particular community issue that you really care about. And so knowing who needs to be persuaded and who needs to be mobilized and who responds to neither really helps out that campaign of yours. And it's also good for just defending yourself with healthy skepticism against candidates' appeals. You should always have a healthy dose of skepticism when it comes to election time, because they're trying all sorts of things for the express purpose of winning your vote and getting into office. And sometimes candidates will do whatever they can to get your vote, which isn't always the most ethical way of doing things. If you are predisposed to vote for somebody or some issue, you need to check your biases that these campaigns are trying to activate to mobilize you. you have to be open to other information coming in instead of needing confirmation bias, where it's just, oh, this person thinks the same as me, then they're good. Okay, I'm just going to vote for them. And then, of course, likewise, if a campaign is trying to convince you to vote for somebody you might be on the fence for or up for grabs for, you still need to evaluate the information that they are using to try to persuade you. For example, you need to know if it's truthful, if it's just tugging at your emotions, even if it's not necessarily being political. All sorts of ways that they try to use to convince you to vote for them. So even on one side, you can't just be too stubborn and just be to the point where you don't take in any other information. You also can't be too open to other information that you are just easily persuaded and you don't have any core beliefs. It is perfectly fine and, in fact, encouraged to have some sort of core beliefs. But to the point where you won't budge on anything, that's where it becomes an issue. So you shouldn't be too easily mobilized and you shouldn't be too easily persuaded. And you'll know what kind of appeals people are using and what you respond to more easily if you understand this distinction between persuasion and mobilization. But again, they can both look the same, and some appeals can be both a form of mobilization and persuasion. I try to make it much more simplified so that it's more easily understandable, but when you really get into it, it can get very complex. So this is just more of a surface level look at things. But that is going to do it for today's episode of the podcast. So thank you so much for listening and tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe and share these episodes with everybody you know. My links are in the show notes, my Facebook page, Paul Rader, author and speaker, my LinkedIn profile, my Medium.com profile, when I write out on political science from time to time, my website, paulrader.org, my 5-day educational email course about how we can more effectively mitigate political polarization in this country. The sign up for that free course is in the show notes as well. And I think I covered all of them. Oh, and then, of course, my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections, How They Can Become More Competitive, which I referenced in this episode. The link for the ebook and paperback format will be in the show notes as well. So, of course, once again, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.